Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get started with the afternoon program now. And it's my great pleasure now to introduce, this is Jutta Engel Development through the Swiss Academy for Development. So good morning to you, Jutta, because it's 5:30 a.m. for her right now. So we very much appreciate the screens here so everybody can see you. Do you want to test your sound and say hello? So the panel session that we're going to step into now is going to take a closer look at safeguarding children. And some of the panel session at the very end of the conference, and we had 4 fantastic panelists, Jutta and myself included, so I can call us fantastic. And we had not enough time to really get into depth in delivering these 4 plenary panel sessions, is to encourage depth. So we'll have streaming in live from Switzerland. And the second, we have a presentation from Chris Mastaglio from Child Fund in Laos. And he is right now he's got the Laos National Women's Rugby team participating. So we're quite excited about that evolution from the activities. That's what we've got for the next session. So we'll start off with Jutta, who's going to set the scene in sport for development and peace. So over to you, Jutta. You're on the big screen, and we've...
Everybody, I hope you had a wonderful lunch, and you had lots of chocolate cake, as Jackie just told me. You know, for me, it's only early morning, so I'm starting up right now. If there are any try to fix them, it's a bit of a pity that I see that you see the right slides, but I think that your region, you're probably much more used to these sorts of presentations at conferences than we would be used to be doing. I'm the international, I'm the executive director of the International Platform on Sport and Development, or sportanddev.org in short, supported by a number of stakeholders.
In Sport for Development, we're Chris's presentation first while we try to sort out a technical hiccup. So Chris is the country director of Child Fund in Laos. He's worked before in Afghanistan in a few different country contexts. He's originally from England, which you'll hear in his accent when he's some of the issues and
things. The important here today, and to thank Sport Matters for their kind invitation to affording children in sport. Building on our presentation at the inaugural presentation, we'd like to reflect on two. Child Fund referring to ways in which both POF and Laos, the representative of the LRF, now implements this short video
village to develop once per month by a team of Lao Rugby. The project, the LRF has seen many exciting developments. Rugby has also provided a platform for different ethnic groups in Nong Khain, successes and challenges of the project to share the pause across the country.
LRF in developing their safeguard in Laos to understand the constraints of working in this space and lives. A recent report highlighted that more than 70% of the country's rhetoric around its identity. Other risks for children identified include prostitution, trafficking, sex tourism, child marriage, substance abuse and sexual abuse, child protection services, and significant investment by donor agencies over the past years as failed policies are passed, no dissemination and little enforcement leaves them largely a wasted investment. In village level are large percent of village level committees working, and where they are, always with external support. The National Child Protection Network system, which mandates cross-ministerial committees at provincial, district and village level, are largely dysfunctional, always with external support. The situation in Laos, with different bodies jostling or making it dependent on reform. There is also a lack of completion, as findings were deemed too sensitive. The first filling the huge gaps in information will be. The situation highlights the critical importance of ensuring that safeguarding practices are in place to reduce risks and to respond appropriately to protect. I'd next like to move on to talking about Child Fund's partner, the Lao Rugby Federation. The LRF more so in a developing country context. These resource challenging safeguarding concepts. However, even with these resource limitations, the LRF for staff and staff were aware of content. However, the major concern of staff and coaches was what to do in the event of disclosure from a child, given their lack of training in the LRF was to look at their existing systems and knowledge. Child Fund supported a series of workshops with the LRF and also to begin dealing with the thorny issue of disclosure. In addition, the organisation, building on the Safeguarding Standards for Children in Sport initiative led by UNICEF UK and others, worked to develop checklists on actions that could be taken to safeguard children in activities. The standards were also translated, however, they are now being updated. So, where are we now? Coaches, volunteers and staff. There are some early steps being taken in terms of safeguarding actions across activities, although many were already happening, just not explicitly linked to safeguarding. Safeguarding tools developed, and there will be an ongoing discussion moving forward to address these issues and warrant much more discussion within and between organisations to look at individual organisations' roles and what steps the partnership. The area in which the partnership currently implements activities is dominated by cultural identity and some cultural practices that are inconsistent with national law and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. This context is a significant challenge to the partnership. What is the Sports Federation in a context like in an already complex space? Is it even necessary for a national federation in a to only player numbers? Village coach, not employed by the LRF, is married or marries someone under the age of 18. With the absence of any services at the district level, what steps can the LRF take to deal with disclosure? Questions that need to be worked on as an organisation that does not do case management. Key factors for many of us to consider around safeguarding children. Player and participant numbers, particularly for girls and vulnerable groups, requires that a safe space be provided. Without this, sustainable growth will not be possible, and certainly it will not be professional populations. For example, in rural and remote communities with a focus on girls, as demonstrated through this partnership. Getting safeguarding on the table early. It is simple maths. As you grow the game, more people means more activities, and protection issues will surface. It's in the interest of all working with sport to get this on their agenda early to avoid any unnecessary exposure to risks and to keep children safe. Communities, participation in sport remains a luxury. Until tangible value add is provided, for example, explicitly building skills that reduce exposure to risks, building a protective environment for children, or developing coping skills, i.e. sport for development, it will remain a challenge to ensure children with inaccessible to many, a challenge for many governing bodies overly obsessed with growing player numbers, and in particular, a challenge for the sport of rugby with an explicit commitment to growing the game in Asia, including growing the game for girls. Analysis, it can be seen to achieve development outcomes with more better utilise sport for development to meet both parties' agendas, and to ensure broader access is provided by being proactive in bringing in steps to safeguard children. I'd like to thank you all for joining this presentation. I hope it provides some reflections that are relevant to your work, and it helps you think through this complex area to allow women's rugby team is performing in the Asian Games. This was unfortunately the reason why I was not able to attend future. Thank you.
You can tell by his accent, Ambassador for Sport for Development, and I think the activities that have been initiated in Laos were a result of that passion and enthusiasm that he started with and brought to the table. That affects Laos in Vientiane, in the capital, but also in the Nong Het field office in the Jiangkwang province that he mentioned. Question and discussion from Chris's presentation. Does anyone have any general comments or observations? This is an open forum, so don't be shy.
On a semi-related point of view, the data acquisition published research narrative is really challenging sometimes when you are working with orphans, or you're working with people who are required. So it's just an issue that we want to protect the children, but the same might help the children.
Okay, can you explain that a little bit more?
Just in terms of requiring ethical review boards require that you get written consent, so it assumes the ability to read and write. It also assumes parental consent for anyone under the age of 18 or 16, depending on the country you're in. Mm-hmm. And so and there is no legal parent or guardian, then some universities say, no, you can't do it.
It's also a factor for the sport federations and the organisations here in the room, and for everybody, getting clearance for people to be able to participate, and getting that sign-off and permission, even from village league. Key issues here, one is getting the engagement, making sure that if you're adding new programs and initiatives that you're not putting children on us. Was if they weren't at school, they were working in the fields with their parents. And what we didn't want to happen was that if we introduced a sport and play program, that then the children were going to be our intervention. So before taking any action, we had a series of discussions with every single village and the leadership of the village, and brought together the Youth Leadership Council across 12 villages we need to go through. Before you start, there's the implementation of the project, and then the external evaluation coming from academics here in Australia, and some of the constraints around that. But I'd like to explore in the room, because we've got such a depth of New Zealand. Luke, I'm going to throw to you, just to put you on the spot, because you're in Vanuatu. Yes. Because Child Fund's also a development agency. So I think the way that the sectoral approach to safeguarding children is very different. Child Fund has to, as a child-friendly organisation, they've got a series of policies and procedures in place for their staff, for their everyone needs to sign off on dedicated child protection been translated into different languages as well. And in that context, they're dealing with 4 different languages. So there's English, there's Lao, there's Hmong, and there's Khmer. So how does this translate for Live and Learn in Vanuatu?
As of international development, and every organisation that volunteers go and volunteer with have to have a child protection policy. Red Cross has a child protection policy. So yeah, it's very, and it's not just about acknowledging your obligations, but also explaining minimum standards for if you see policy, what the processes should be and the minimum expectations.
Chris referred to on that presentation there. So for one of the challenges for Lao Rugby Federation, the LRF, was if things are being disclosed, does the local system have the capacity to deal with that? And what is the course of action that's taken for benefit of the development agencies here in the room?
Child protection policies and anybody who's going to be working with children. Discovered in Cambodia a lot of challenges and a lot of danger, not only to Western staff, but also to the child, it's his or herself. So we are definitely still struggling with that, but as we get deeper into our program, hopefully we'll have some more resources.
Awesome. That's something Chris mentioned as well, that if the systems and some of the, or the knowledge base to be able to initiate those types of the development agencies here in the room. I'm just trying to think. Frank, your program is, so how do you incorporate safeguarding practices at the Oceania Football Confederation?
Okay, I would last year, if you remember, during the Peace and you hear me?
I think you two.
No, maybe not.
I think her screen is frozen.
The sound is good. It's all right.
Yeah.
So when we work with children, we need to make sure that each adult in contact with children. When we deliver the training for coaches, so means teachers and volunteers, only ask them to sign. We explain, in fact, what are the children's rights. And during the protection messages within the activities, so it means that they also on children what they can get as a support if they have a trouble. Adult to sign, but also to explain to children that they have right. I know it's a big, very simple way. So if you want, I can show you the exercise we have developed. And I need to thank a lot UNICEF because they have helped us a lot. This message is included within our activities.
Awesome. And sitting right next to you is a representative from rugby, who's now going to be put on the spot, the Australian Rugby Union.
To be fair,
Yep.
To be fair, I don't know too much at this point because I've only just started, but I do as a requirement of a program. It'll be a challenge for me to understand and whether or not the living documents within those programs, but that's absolutely the intent behind them.
Awesome. In the Australian context, there's a changing landscape for child protection, and the system for the child protection clearances is about to change and is in a transition. So all of the states and territories have up until now had a separate system for doing clearances, and this is relevant for anybody working with children, and that's about which is the system here for Queensland, and it's different in every state. That's now being merged into one. But the requirements in Australia and the requirements in the developing country context are very, very different. And the protection mechanisms that we need in place are from the duty bearers around them. So I think it's a very, very critical issue. Has anyone in their organisations had issues reported that they're able to speak of, perhaps remotely? No? Oh yeah, go ahead, Frank.
When we talk about child abuse, for instance, it's really difficult to talk about sex with children. We cannot because usually in the Pacific region they are also from religion. So you need to be very, very careful the way to children. So what we have done, just develop a content that talk about how to protect ourselves and without talking any sexual matters.
That's a really good point, because what people do in the sport and development space is really open up that discussion, and that well, if we're talking about young people, that they would open up to and that they would share, need to be equipped to be able to deal with that, and then have some safeguards around where that information goes and when things need to be escalated.
And so we've got this child when you deal with children.
Yep.
And then we have also developed a procedure what to do if one children talk to one adult about sexual abuse or so you need also to help adults that will be confronted to this kind of because you have built this a trust relationship with the child, so you can what you're going to do with this information. So it's also a thing about how you can help adults to deal with.
Translating the International Convention on the Rights of the Child and getting that child rights and child protection. Chris mentioned that in his presentation as well, some of the challenges around that. What do we do, Phil? I think I can do that. What were we saying about protection? Yuta, good morning. Thank you for staying with us. I'm sorry for that small technical hiccup. We're on one internet with you. I'm going to be quiet now and throw to you.
I could not really follow the discussion, but if you use the microphone diligently, I can much better hear you guys. I think that of sportanddev.org, and I hope that you all know sportanddev.org. I will not go into it. If you haven't found the resource yet, please go and check it out. It's been around organizations and individuals to actually gain visibility. Today I'm there in the function of introducing you to the work of the International Working Group on Safeguarding Children in Sport. This group has actually got together out of many of the reasons that you just discussed. And many of the reasons Chris already covered in his presentation. And I think that it's important to some of these problems that globally relevant safeguarding standards for children in sport. We've had long discussions about these which are, as Jackie just said now, a translation of the rights of the child and in normal life, but also in sport and development. We've now come up with something that we all think is maybe a feasible way of denoting these principles in different languages, and we really want people to the principles that we set. So we're talking about 11 safeguards that we so far have aligned, and I think that I can almost skip the next slides, because what I wanted to do is go into what is going on with what's the harm that we need to protect children from. And I think that it's important that we don't only talk about sexual harassment, that we don't talk about, as well, but also to talk about the legal or the illegal. So I think we need to, can you go back to the slide up again? Yeah, there. So what I talk about is what the SAFE really entails, and I think that it's important to talk about the harm that can be inflicted from child to child with pushing and shoving, with bullying, and with unfair play. And that children really need clear guidelines to not use the space to be bullying their while they are in their surveillance, that this is not happening, and that they are trained, space they're given for unfair play. It's also about organizations making sure, next slide please, that bystanders do not harm the child, not being photographed, which is probably something that has been in the media most. It's about verbal abuse, and the verbal abuse might be, legitimized in many cases as pushing the limits and making people successful in sport. But there's a limit to it, harm and physical harm to children. And I think that the sexual part is just a little step in organizations. It sort of happens. The standards are just watered down to a degree that it's almost addictive to go back and to make sure that you can show what you can do and that you can resist this physical and verbal abuse that is inflicted by parents and caregivers. It's also, especially the verbal abuse, is something that many parents are probably not even aware of. There's kill the other, or you can do it and animate to abuse that children can't come home having lost. There's also the part that sport is part of the life of the child and needs to be seen as such. So the coach, if they see that there's physical abuse going on at home or in school, how do they react to that? If it's not being done in the sports setting, but in other settings, and then you have a child with that, you react to that. So these guidelines, these safeguards are meant to protect also the coaches and those that are responsible in extracurriculum time for. When you translate all of this, what does it mean? It means that the policy needs to be proactive, not reactive. It's not to wait for it to satisfy parents that there is something in place. It's not to comply with legal create safe spaces for a child. They need to be universal, like we said before, because we just heard how difficult it is that communities cannot react to because the legal framework or the traditions actually speak against it. So it makes it very difficult to, but they need to be, as I said before, need to support all stakeholders. Coaches need to feel safe with these safeguarding principles. They need not to be threatened, as it is for the coaches themselves, which means that organizations should not be forced their own ambitions and to live by them, and if they don't work for them, to revise them. So next slide, please. So the international working group actually came together. International Inspiration is a charity set up by UK Sport, and by now on its own, UK actually called organizations together to think about these safeguards and to think of what happened. Next slide, such as keeping children safe, the Swiss Academy for Development, Right to Health Secretariat is part of it, Beyond Sport is part of it. And so there's quite a few organizations in the world of sport, but also in safeguards as quickly as possible and have a dissemination on a level that these safeguards can be integrated in the policy making of organizations. Can you go back, please, to the other slide? Could you go back, please? Yeah, thank you. So there are three areas to our current work. There's the definition of the thing and what the best ideas behind it is, so that the component in this research is done by Brunel University on whether these safeguards that are defined so far are actually the right ones and the relevant ones. And then there are international learning sets that we are running with, at one hand, governors and on getting organizations together in phone calls, actually very practical. What are the needs? How do they best implement? Next slide. Safeguards with you. Every single one could have a discussion of its own for a full day. We don't have 11 days, but I think also talk about the community has actually written down for us and made sure that of installing these as policy. I think that every organization should have a written policy in place. Written is important, policy is more important, but written is important because it should be a document that is available and accessible for everybody. The challenge is funding for policy development, and that's not only true for the small child protection and safeguarding policies are most likely not the ones that make decisions on funding. So it's quite difficult, International Federation, to have a written policy. Nations have signaled that this process of installing makes sure that all stakeholders are involved, parents are consulted, that management is in the topic as such, which means that it creates a safe space and acting proactively. Patients should know exactly, or everybody working in the org need to do, have people in place that deal with it, that are knowledgeable and can use to make sure that the press is informed but not informed in the wrong way, that there's safeguard is minimizing risks for children by assessing and eliminating possibilities for abuse. This sounds very easy, but the challenge within many organizations is, and that stakeholders are frightened about the topic. And I think it is because we are always very quickly talking about sexual harassment rather than all the other forms of abuse that are also. It is important that this is sort of broken down, and that when we talk about safeguarding and child protection, that we don't only talk about the most horrific cases of sexual abuse, or that we don't wait until rather than successes are screened. Next slide, please. The fourth safeguard. This sounds as if it is a natural, and if we didn't have to discuss it, but it is a very make organizations aware of how they want children to be treated while they are in their care. The challenges are that very little can be found openly and accessibly. So it's about sharing what is there that is needed. The next is the equity principles to be adhered to. And it sounds very easy, but it is probably one of the most challenging ones, because women's rights, of gays and lesbian rights, of rights of people with disability. So every child, no matter where they're treated equally, and that is a very important principle also in safeguarding children. The sixth principle would be continued communication with all stakeholders. It is the topic into action. It is, however, also an opportunity, also bystanders, by actually discussing the topic, to keep the communication up and to keep these guidelines alive. Next slide, please. The last 5 principles here. Education and training. Most organizations that are working for the organizations, especially in smaller organizations where you have a lot of turnover, of the signal that there are other things that are more important for them. That is sometimes much more. But once you start the process, there in many organizations there's been a lot of ownership that has created, that was created by having senses. Is the standard, the safeguard number 8. The expertise of what is to be called an incident, how do we deal with it within the legal framework of the country and the community, and how do we deal with the press. All of these things need to be very clearly outlined, and people that are engaged, no matter whether they are the ones that cause of such abuse, actually need to be supported in the process, and they need to a degree where others get so afraid to signal incidences. So the 8th and the 9th, the promotion of proliferation of the standards is probably something that is important, so that we all reach the level of international awareness about safeguarding standards. And then we point that we do all of this so that children can protect themselves. Respectful handling of their personality, of their individuality is actually breached, and that they can actually get back at people saying, no, I don't want you to treat me like that, so that incidences actually cannot occur. The last one is the monitoring and evaluation, and with many, even with the intervention itself, monitoring is quite difficult, and monitoring and evaluation in terms of how do you do with you more remote from the day-to-day activity, but needs to be done by people in the field. So we can't have the external monitor or the external evaluator come in and evaluate how an organization really is doing on this. We need definitely a challenge for many organizations, not only because of lack of knowledge how to measure complex issues like safety and well-being of children, but also because there's lack of fund, lack of time. Sometimes, I'm sure if you are an organization that implements in the field, you know that there's other things that overlap with this key interest of an organization, knowing how they are scaling, how they are doing in the field of child protection. In evaluation data, it's possible to share that with others and to create a very, very much, if it was not by smaller ones. So these are the 11 safeguards that we have so far identified. I'd really like to go very quickly into the international learning sets, because I would like to invite everybody that is interested in participating in them, discussing the day-to-day stuff on the ground. Currently we have about 40 organizations involved, those that are deliverers on the ground, because we realized in the discussions that it is about, I want to say that you can't make it that time, you can also think on how active and we would like to. It was found that the most important support for creating and organizations, so that also ownership, that creates ownership of people worked by day-to-day care of the children, and really figuring out where do we need to have that reflected in the safeguarding principles with peers and similar organizations. But it's because it is detached from the day-to-day work, it's actually something that is very important. The horizontal learning is perceived as the least confrontational and most effective with those organizations that have been interviewed by Brunel University. It seems to be that the topic as such is very confrontational. Organizations that have nothing in place are sort of don't have a living document in place, are also a bit afraid about talking about it. So there needs to be also, for the discussion of how you get these things up and running, horizontal learning groups, the ILSs are very good forums for that. I have 3 more slides, so bear with me. Dev doing this, we are trying to be the communication tool and function as the safe communication space for action, in which there are basic principles of why is there such a thing as child protection safeguarding and why should it be in place. And there will be a toolkit section on the management of such a thing online by the end of the month. On the topic, encouraging the ILSs, the members of the ILSs to publish their best practices. So we're trying to ever so often inform about the topic and keep it up on the agenda. Objectives of the working group, therefore, was threefold. It's a repetition of what I said before. It's the development of the global relevant safeguarding standards, the safeguards. It's the 3-year research safeguards. I think that see how feasible these standards are, and secondly, whether they are completely formulated in the right way, and then all the children participating in sport are kept safe in all the levels of harm that can be inflicted. Use the microphone so that I can hear you. And I'm also to be reached if you please also contact me on that email address that you can see there.
Does anyone have questions? I think it's time for us to be asleep, Jutta.
I hope not. I hope not. The mood in the room when you're not in the room.
That's okay. I just asked the question and got a lot of... At Sport Matters, we have some obligations as an NGO, as a member of the Australian Council for International Development, with their code of conduct across all areas of international development. So that reflects human rights, financial reporting. It's very, very comprehensive, but child protection is absolutely one of those. This year, I was grilled about how in-depth our policies and procedures were for people in country reporting incidences around child protection. So whilst I could defend what we have in place here, it was how is it how comfortable would children feel, and do they have a point of contact points here? And we followed all the steps, but we need to take it one step further to make sure, and so we build those child protection, it's just us. And I think this is such a critical area for everybody. Everybody, when you're going forward in your work in sport for development and peace, keeps the safeguarding message for children in every context. And as Jutta said, it's so diverse. And it's important that we keep that really global framework on all of the components around this topic. So Jutta, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We'll be thinking of you tonight while we're all dressed up in our island-style outfits.
I can imagine it's going to be wild. I just want to now, referring to the frameworks that you as an organization are working in, I think that there's lots of these frameworks, but it's just a question, how do you keep them alive within an organization? I can just share a real quick, very practical experience that we've had with our partners, you know, the trainers. After into management, we asked the management to trickle it down and to make sure that the local trainers actually knew what they were, you know, what they were getting into by signing their contract. And then the next time we came and visited the local organization, we got a bunch of English language agreements given back to us. Most of the coaches don't really speak English, so all the talking that then something language. So we understood that there was much more to be done, and that there needed a translation of the procedures, how to escalate things, and also a culturally adapted space where people could talk about this. And this is the, you know, this is the day-to-day stuff that we have international federations that have the need to break it down for their local representatives.
Requirements and the obligations for people that are operating in sport for development here in government, that have, if they're working in Australia, have got one set of obligations. If they're receiving funding through AusAid, which is now called DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, they've got some new standards for child protection and procedures as well in different directions, and you need to report both ways. But on the flip side of that, our organisation's being approached by people left, right and centre. In Timor a few weeks ago, someone said the same. You know, someone's wanting to start a new project in Victoria. I'd like to go to set something up on a Saturday in my community with no care or concern for some of these issues. So this is why we exist, to try to generate these discussions, and I think we really thank you for joining us today to really set the scene, and also to Chris. We're going to roll on with the rest of our program now, and violence. That was good timing. Thanks, Phil. Much.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
And good morning. All right, next I'd like to welcome to the stage Stephanie Hanrahan, who's going to moderate the next session. Stephanie for this event. So we welcome Stephanie and thank the university. And next we're looking at gender-based violence. I'll hand over to Stephanie.
First, very quickly, everyone who's capable of doing so, stand up and sit down 3 times really quickly. This is after lunch lull, but I can see the glaze in his eyes. Sit down, stand up, stand up, come on. Yeah. And we'll move along quickly. quickly. Normally I would do more than that, but we don't have time because we're already way behind time. So to start off with, Luke, I'm going to present for AFL player and Australian volunteer for international development. So we'll start with him, and then both of them up here with questions panel, since we don't have to worry about Skype and IT and all that stuff.
Cool, I don't even have a PowerPoint, so let's keep it very low tech for the next few minutes. Thanks, Jackie, again for having me here. For those who don't know me, firstly, if you have heard this story before, which you may have in Canberra, I apologise. If it's boring for the second time around, please forgive me. For those who don't know who I am, my name's Luke. 133 games and the 2005 Premiership. Let's not talk about the week. Since then, however, I'm taking a specific interest in their Respect and Responsibility program, which is a violence prevention program working with men, particularly working throughout the AFL community from the elite level all the way down through to community clubs and some junior homophobia, a whole bunch of other things too, and that's where I'll spend most of my time talking very briefly this morning. Looking particularly at just general capacity building activities with Rose to get some money through the Australian Red Cross for a small grants program for volunteers, and I managed to get a small amount of funding and developed, I guess, and helped implement a 4-week gender-based violence prevention. Ultimately we called it the Respectful Relationships Program. One of the things that we've learnt, and I guess research shows, that if you go in and talk to men, particularly in the Pacific and other parts of the world where violence against women is extreme, it's very prevalent, if you go in and start, they may even walk out of the room. So we decided to call it a Respectful Relationships Week program, as I mentioned. Basically, the 4 weeks were, week 1 was about masculinity and about gender and sex, and very basic, I guess, an introduction. But most pressures they feel to be a man, what does it mean to be a man in Vanuatu, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So really focusing on themselves. About a month before this program started, or a couple of months before, particularly in this context, and one of the things philosophical was these guys kept bringing it down to a home level, about mum and dad, and about community and family and home is so important for these guys. So it was really, well, week 2 was really focusing on decision making within the home, particularly between mum and dad. Who makes the decisions? Who decides on them? What about sexual consent, sexual assault and rape? That we really spoke about violence against women. And I think it helped because we didn't get that defensiveness. We'd had 2 weeks for young guys to talk about themselves, to talk about we didn't talk about violence. It kind of came up on its own, but we didn't force it down their throat. And I feel by doing that, we got them on side to a point where they were happy to talk about a conversation. In their minds it was. In some situations it was completely okay. And then week 4 we spoke more specifically about family violence. So I'm not going to sit here and suggest that it changed the world and we got a standing ovation and got carried out on people's shoulders, but I think we did have, if nothing else, and this might be a bit idealistic and a bit first time that these guys had that conversation. And I think that was really, didn't always say it, and the same with the didn't always disagree. They didn't always say that they disagreed, but they were great to work with. But them thinking, that myself and my colleague who I worked with, my country manager in Vanuatu, Andrina Thomas, who's an amazing woman, had actually created an argument, a solid, hopefully well-researched, well-founded argument as to why it's not okay to hit your wife. So again, that might be, but I felt with these young kids it was a really good, and very briefly, and I'll just finish it, I have some of the key things that I think we found in that discussion. As was just mentioned, the thing about the safe space, making it okay for guys to talk about their emotions. Guys in Australia aren't very good at it. Guys in the Pacific are even worse at talking about their fears, their insecurities, all those things. So trying to create a safe space, and again, I don't think we did it perfectly, but I think by having those discussions about them first and foremost gave us an opportunity. As Yutha said, alluded to, it was all in Bislama, the local pidgin English of Vanuatu. We had a male and a female speaking to them. I had a man speaking to them in their local language. And I guess one thing that I find interesting next time is, in Vanuatu there's this concept of Bosplo House, which is the man is the... And to be honest, I think it's a waste of time if you try to change that. But what I think could be really valuable is trying to redefine what that means. So in Vanuatu, boss blow house, do what you want them to do. You're this leader, this leader who's at the front dragging everyone along. So what I was thinking, and again, this is not based on any, redefining what that leadership looks like, and we made the analogy with cricket, of what's a good captain? What's a good responsibility? Shows you some trust, asks your opinion, gives you some, an opportunity to shine in those situations. And I think that analogy in that context really worked. Putting it into a context or a setting that they could understand and they could grasp. The challenges are enormous, and there's a huge list of them. Very briefly, not allowing the guys to shift the blame to the woman, of going, well, if she just did that, then I wouldn't need to do this. That happens. We didn't do that. Basically, women don't deserve the things that you're talking about, and that's, if you can change that, then we won't need to have these conferences for too much longer and talk about gender-based violence. And again, from a sporting context, but if you wanted to work with just in Australia, it's not like you go down to the local footy ground and there's a change room and a social footy, and, for example, and then leave again. So trying to find those structures that you can work within can be really challenging. That's probably enough as a kind of intro. Yep.
Originally have 3 people in this panel, one who was actually female, but she couldn't get her visa for Australia in time, so we have 2 males for this conversation. A different perspective on the topic. I'd like to now introduce Matt Bolton, a White Ribbon Ambassador.
Okay. And it's a story of when I was a 12-year-old boy, and I, like a lot of 12-year-old boys, used to like to tinker with my bike, and I had a tool for doing. I had a shifting spanner, and I used to love to adjust all the nuts and all that. You could adjust the seat by spinning it right out. You could pull it right in and adjust the brake cables. You could adapt to all different sizes. There was a young lad down the road who was a little bit older than me in cars, and so he was a little bit of a mentor. And he came down one day and he said, "Matt, what are you doing as I just did to you?" He said, "Matt, you don't use..." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Size spanners, this is just convenient." He said, "Well, don't you sometimes, does the spanner not sometimes slip off the nuts?" And I said, "Oh, yes." I said, "Yeah." He said, "And when that happens, do you swear out loud?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, again, amazing what you can get in here. Wait till you see my chainsaw. A set of these, and once I found that perfect fit on, and I share that story because it taught me some principles that day. Cultures are a pain and they don't like inconvenience. It's a truth universally, I think, for men and but the really good, that doesn't come with all of the inconvenience. It doesn't come with all the negative. Go back to the old blunt tools, because to do so would be to choose inconvenience. Well, what's this got to do with the subject of gender? But understand gender-based violence. Would that be okay? A tool that men use to get what they want. Violence, working with couples in conflict that we're heading toward, and one-on-one sessions. I was invited by a friend who was a volunteer with Australian Volunteers Abroad in the Solomon Islands. I was invited by her to help send some resources over. She said, "Please send some resources over for some friends of mine here in the Christian Care Centre, which was run by the whole Solomon Islands." And the only thing they had was that the nuns there would pray with the ladies. Violence probably wasn't enough. What do you think? So this is a country with the 3rd worst domestic violence in the world. So I said, I think I can do a bit better than send resources. Let me come and train these people. And don't bother wasting your time talking into that culture, because... But I had a bit of prevalent in that culture. It wasn't... So my approach was not to go in as the big man. My approach was to tell I was a perpetrator of domestic violence. 21 years ago, my domestic violence led to a breakdown in my marriage, where we were separated for 10 months, and I had to go and find new tools. I had to go and humble myself to do things like domestic violence, and a miracle happened, which my behaviours and attitudes, my behaviours change, was able to start. Cut a long story short, we've been back together. I've never reoffended for, well, the last 20 years, and have now 2 great children. So I thought I will go and tell my story, because you can argue with the theory, but you can't argue with the story in the way. So, work with cultural leaders, as well as speaking to church groups, corporates, the Soul Brew Brewery and the BJES Group and Central Bank. I did some training with the Royal Solomon Islands. Leaders in that culture were the sports people. So, meeting with the Maris Football Club, with these guys, a story as simple as this. I'm not here to change your culture. I've only been in it for 2 days, but I'm here to share a story of 2 ways that I've tried to live 2 years, and then for another 20 years I've tried it this way. So could I share after these that were learning reason and to hang their heads in shame and acknowledge that they actually... one of the things that really saddened me was when I did an interview for the Solomon Islands Broadcasting Corporation, the lady who interviewed me had on hearing everywhere I went this issue ever. Now, I don't know whether that's probably changed in the last 5 years. Never heard a man speaking to men about this issue. And I want to suggest to you today that in Solomon Islands, Australia, we're not going to stop domestic violence with an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff mentality. The word stop domestic violence. It does not stop violence against women. If we're going to stop violence against women, I suggest that our approach must address men's responsibility. And have chosen to be an ambassador with White Ribbon because it's an organisation about men addressing men and getting men to take. It's an organisation where men swear an oath never to commit. Those 3 elements are stop violence against women. Our approach must not alienate perpetrators. That monsterising domestic violence perpetrators is not very helpful for the group that you're trying to work with. It tends to lead to a hardening of gender-based violence, or as I prefer to call it, gender-excused violence. Good news is that although there are narratives in these cultures, as there are in our cultures, gender-based narratives, kind of like the bus that men get onto. The real world is that the problem is that men choose these narratives. So there is beliefs about women are not as hardwired as you might expect. They're actually often more like a tree and then draws a target around it. And that gives me a lot of hope. Because it's formed by shame, it's formed by an effort to save face. With the men that I've worked with these so-called beliefs about women and their place. Interestingly, when you give them tools and you help them with how to relate and how to, and a lot of stuff that Luke has shared, you can actually see some of those excuses. To stop violence against women, we must come alongside perpetrators and find better tools for life and relationships. How do we begin to do that? Well, if we hate them, I suggest leave the role for somebody else. You're not going to... Dr. John Warlow has a model for counselling and therapy, the CURE model, C-U-R-E, and it works like this: connect and then evaluate. If we're not prepared to connect, we can never understand. If we're not prepared to... The sniper method that gives us a nice distant vantage point to attack, it's somewhat helpful, although statistics are seeming to show us that it's... and retooling. It's not only changed the hundreds of men that I've worked with, but it's changed me, and I can only share my story today and hope that I can open up some new questions. Gender-based violence across different cultures that you're working in. Thanks for your time.
So we'll now open up to
Microphone's right behind you.
Has changed, because in the sport I'm involved with, it used to be a big promotion about stop violence against women, and we've actually moved to... Have you seen that? And I just get your feeling.
Me? I guess for me personally, I guess over the last kind of year or two of kind of working in this field, kind of violence against women prevention to just looking at violence more broadly. Violence in any... One of the biggest keys to stopping violence, or the call to behave, and I think it is kind of moving towards that a real man doesn't hit women and stuff. And I guess in a way, I don't think those messages are first and foremost, and how men think that other people see them is really important to preventing that violence against women, violence against men, that one punch stuff that we're seeing a lot in Sydney. Said the common thing through all that is men. You know, men experience more violence than women, but it's always at the hands of other men as well. So looking at what is it about men, and I'm a strong believer that it is nurture, about how we define men, what we expect of men, what we think of men. And, you know, Matt's story about when he was a child, I remember when I was a kid, you know, like all these kind of things and comments, but on reflection, they tell you very clearly from a very young age what role you're meant to take in your relationship. You know, thinking back now, there's a lot of things that we have to take them back.
I would say I like that the message is changing subtly, and that we are getting some of those positive slants on violence. I think one of the things we've got to be very careful about, though, are any statements that begin with real men this, real men that. The moment, oh, I do that, and further marginalise them from healing can happen in a community or by other men.
Any other questions over here?
Through your experiences, what do you find has been the ideal age for introducing gender-based violence? What sort of an age should we try and target? Should we target younger children to try and change perception moving forward? Or is it too late if we start at sort of adulthood when we start trying to change their perception of gender-based violence?
Well, working with adults or a multi-generation, confronting their own beliefs, but they're passing down, and is when my kids were at a appropriate age, was to share with them my story, how I've treated your mother, and this is what I've learnt, that that's not okay, and that this is now how I do things, and talk them and walk them through that.
What did you perceive to be that appropriate age?
I don't think there is an appropriate age. I think that's something that you, as a parent, you know that intuitively. For my kids, I think my son was 10, my daughter was 12. It was probably around about when we had that discussion, and it came up naturally when we were separated, and so I was able to just bring that in naturally as part of a conversation and give them plenty of space and time.
Yeah, I'd just like I think, education around relationships and violence and stuff can kind of happen at any age. The messages have to change, obviously. I think, as we mentioned earlier, you're probably not going to talk about sex and rape to a bunch of 10-year-old kids, but the discussion is, I was lucky enough, things like 1 in 5 people think either excuse violence, they should be, women's place in the kitchen or in the bedroom or whatever. Those kind of relationships fundamentally cause violence against women and fundamentally cause violence. Work, schools, everything is, I would argue, far more valuable than sitting through a formal education program that talks about gender-based violence.
Given that you're travelling throughout the South Pacific, we have men's sheds and women's programs and things like that, but I'm a strong believer in early intervention. I believe in going to the young men before the incident occurs. Early intervention programs, there's a Jamaican, what he focuses on is teaching young men the values of young women, and he makes no excuses for how young men will treat young women if they're not taught person when it comes to households. But what you will find in the islands is that you have a full program or impactful progress in a closed site is lacking from a number of programs is who's the facilitator. You touched on it, that I strongly believe that when you deliver and you are of that person's community, you have more assurance of attendance and them taking a genuine interest on what you're there to deliver. So early intervention resources are tailored around their community needs, as opposed to going in with an Australian model and giving it to Samoa.
Yeah.
And even beyond that, like in Vanuatu, what you would deliver in Port Vila is completely different to what you'd deliver to a remote island. Completely separate. So yeah, agree with everything you just said.
Question.
Showing some delightful IT skills today. I have a question for you. I'm looking for your advice. There's a lot of people in the audience that are interested in making a difference across a range of different development themes. One of those is gender-based violence, not only in the Pacific, but we know that the rates are extraordinarily high there. And there's a lot of focus internationally on this topic and sport as a tool to address this issue. My question to you is, what's your advice on creating a safe space to prepare our teams for that?
It's on the ground.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw in the book. Look, like I said, I've worked in Australia and Vanuatu, so I don't claim to be any kind of expert. Potentially can be expanded to include other parts of the Pacific, but in Vanuatu, everything needs to go through chiefs. And those real community leaders. If you can engage with chiefs and you can engage with the local pastor or whoever the highest ranking church official, and not even that you won't get, you'll get sabotage people. So without question, regardless of if you don't do that, you won't get anywhere. So it's really, and gatekeepers can be a nightmare to work with. I did some research, I did some study last year, and the whole, everything gatekeepers wherever they could, but sometimes you just have to do it, and that would be the absolute starting. More in-depth insights than that.
I just said the key to unlock the gate is use our own heart.
Yeah.
And even then, like getting the staff member, like if I'm a white guy in Vanuatu, at least taking along a NEBAN staff member with me. Hopefully it's a he, having a conversation with a chief who's almost certainly going to be a male in that context, if they of getting any kind of traction with those people.
Make friends with the sons of the chief.
Do you do you participate in any activities like kava or ceremonial stuff like before you, because if you're new in the area, then that's part of the protocol to be with. How was that experience? Have you experienced?
I guess in my experience, in my experience, it was, because it was a national kind of Nakamal experience, I guess, where we all sat around and spoke. But in saying that, I spent hours at the Vanuatu Cricket Association talking. I'd just call in after work and say g'day. And again, yeah, in the Pacific, everything's about family. Everything's about the family, the church, local relationships, and anything you can do just to kind of make it like you're making an effort to get to know them, to get to a deeper understanding, a deeper acceptance of who you are. But yeah, all of those kind of, and again, as the outsider, as the white guy, it's a huge help. And I guess, and to be honest, being a former professional athlete helped. Unfortunately not everyone has that, but I kids that I used to play football, and they're not necessarily huge football fans, but they kind of understood what it meant, and that kind of carried some weight as well. But those kind of traditional cultural things are invaluable. And yeah, if you are going to the community and you're talking to if you can get into that community, get to know them, say hello to the wife, see the kids, all that kind of stuff, balanced with not being the outsider white guy going in, like a tourist. That's I guess the balance you have to find. Yeah.
Thank you. Last question from Jackie.
One of the risks in this area, and having some messages at a professional game, for example, around gender-based violence, whether it's positive or negative, Ben's question before. Have you got some advice for us on that, and how that relates to the risk there? I'm sorry. Well, the risk there is that if you do put a shirt on someone that says, stop gender-based violence, and it's actually perpetrated as tokenistic, and it's not really what it is, how we can really have some meaningful interaction some meaningful discussion and do more than branding. Your work within AFL in that area.
Sorry.
How does this link with your work in AFL?
How does gender-based violence? Sorry, I got a bit lost.
Does the gender-based violence stuff you're doing relate in any way to the AFL stuff you're doing? And if so, how?
Well, we had completely different messaging and a whole bunch of different stuff, but the stuff we did at the AFL was, you know, about accessing young kids 16 and above, and have those discussions. And I guess there's two fundamentally different things between Australia and work in the Pacific. In the Pacific, or in Australia, using violence. In the Pacific, I think it's probably the opposite, and that fundamentally changes the way the discussions that you're having. It's delivering serious messages and also being able to have a laugh at the same. Anyway, at all answer the question that you just asked.
Yeah, a little bit. But if you're finding people within a sporting context that you know are perpetrators,
okay, yeah. One of the discussions that I had with a lot of people in Villa is, given that so many men in the Pacific are using violence, or even if they're not, probably condone it, how do you approach people? And one of the really powerful things we never got to do, and I now don't do it because of these reasons. Now, we haven't had a chance to trial that, and I don't know if it's been trialled in other parts of the world, but that was kind of where we're at, because it's really difficult, I would argue, to find men who haven't been violent in the past or who don't support it. So if you do find those men who have changed their behaviour for whatever reason, you know, having men speak to men about women and about, if you've got a guy who's violent, the whole community knows that he's hitting his wife every night. I used to do it. You all know I used to.
No, that's awesome. That's exactly what Matt's just done here today.
Absolutely. And I think, and I would like to support Matt's argument that, you know, we can't demonise. I actually said in a conference in Sydney a couple of years ago, he hates the word perpetrators because it's all consuming, it's all defining. It doesn't allow men who use violence because it's a small part. Behaviours should be shamed, but the person shouldn't be, because it doesn't allow for any kind of change, and it doesn't allow people to. Important that, you know, again, acknowledging the significance of what they're doing, but, you know, allowing a space for those.
A small thought on that. I recall that when we were separated in Australia, and seeing a poster that said, "Men who beat women lose everything," and it listed a few things, and I just went, oh, holy crap, I'm not talking to anyone then. And it was just so counterproductive. And I think that's in Australia. What about in a context where face saving is so much more important? Yeah, we've just got to be really careful about those shaming messages.
Well, I'd like to thank very much.
Oh,
and after afternoon tea, I believe cricket will be next door and football will be upstairs.